Hello everyone, I am Lyra the Jester, and in this video I shall be assembling a dice bag for the dice I use for Dungeons & Dragons and Magic the Gathering. I apologize for the camera work as I'm still just using my camera, but nevertheless I still got some footage that I can use, and hopefully you still enjoy. The first step in this process was to design a pattern. I already knew the design of the bag that I wanted to make, so what I did is I went into Cinema 4D and I did up a rough 3D mock-up of what I was looking to do. I needed a sphere primitive as it was the closest to the shape that I wanted to create. After creating the sphere, I made its segment count 36 as it is easily divisible by the number of panels that I wanted. The reason I chose 36 instead of the simpler 6 segments is because I wanted the detail in the curve in the up-down axis, and it was easier to simplify the curve around the lateral axis as opposed to trying to create a more definitive curve around the up-down axis. Once I was satisfied with the shape that I had, I exported one of the faces into an STL file that I then imported into Pepakura. From there, I used Pepakura to create the actual pattern that I needed for the bag. Since this bag is really just one panel repeated 6 times, I didn't need 6 individual pattern pieces for each panel. It turns out that the model I originally made was actually bigger than I intended, so I actually had to go back into Cinema 4D and experiment with changing the sizes a bit in order to get the exact size that I was looking for. However, once I had that all figured out, everything was done and ready to print. There are a few materials that I'm going to be using for this project. The first materials that I'll be using is this Vienna velvet that I have left over from when I made my cloak. Next is this lining material that I'm going to be using for the inside of the bag. I also have this nice white rope that I'm going to be using for the actual drawstring of the bag. And then of course the pattern that I printed out earlier. I got some scissors to cut everything out. And of course, all of the dice that will go into the bag itself. After cutting out the pattern, I needed to trace it onto the materials that I was using. Luckily, my roommates have lots of markers that I can use for this task. I've used the same black marker that I did when making my cloak, so I know that it's not going to show through to the other side of the material. Here I am simply tracing the pattern onto the inside of the material that's not going to show. At first I tried holding the pattern down by hand, but I found my hand wasn't steady enough to hold it perfectly still. So instead, I went to find a weight to hold it down for me. After tracing out 3 segments onto the green velvet, I then proceeded to rough cut them off of the main panel of the material. When cutting out each panel, I decided to leave a rough seam allowance around the edge. This meant that I wasn't actually cutting along the black line that I'd traced out, but instead leaving about a rough 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch edge around the outside. Of course, this idea of rough cutting a seam allowance does not come biting me in the ass a little later down the line. Now, I wanted the top edge of the panel to be as straight as possible, so I'm using a ruler along with one of these pizza fabric rolling cutter things. I'm not sure what they're actually called, but I'm using these two together in order to give me that straight edge that I'm looking for. I then repeat this process, making 3 panels of the blue velvet as well. It is at this point that I realize that I didn't schedule myself properly, as I need to get ready for an escape room with my players. So I decide to leave the rest of this project for the next day. So I decide to mark my progress with a bit of a hand flourish, showing how the panels are going to be arranged for the finished project. After 2 escape rooms, 1 failed and 1 successful, I am back the next day to continue. To get a better sense of how I'm sewing these panels together, I decided to pin them together in order to figure this out. However, as I foreshadowed earlier, it is at this point that I discover that the way I made my seam allowances would make it rather difficult to actually sew these panels together. My original plan was to simply follow the line that I had traced out, but unless I do extensive pinning, being able to follow the lines accurately on both sides would be very difficult, since the seam allowance isn't even on all sides and is very wavy in general. Rather than starting over from scratch, I've decided to cut along the lines that I had traced out. As a result, when sewing these together, I figure I'm going to be using the foot of the actual sewing machine to determine seam allowance as opposed to the measurements along the base plate. And now it's time to cut the lining panels out. The reason I'm doing a lining is because I have quite a number of dice, and I didn't want all of that weight to be suspended purely by the velvet, as I wasn't sure if the velvet alone could take the weight of all my dice. I simply repeated the steps as before, except this time when cutting the pieces out, I made sure to cut out on the line itself. This lining material actually turned out to be really difficult to work with, and repeatedly had to cut over and over in order to get through the material. The scissors were able to cut it just fine, but as you'll see later on, it doesn't like the sewing machine much as well either. Now it is time to actually sew all of the panels together. As I said earlier, I'm using the foot of the sewing machine to guide my seam allowance. This does mean that I don't have a lot of wiggle room, so that means I have to be extremely slow and careful with my seam lines. Sewing this lining material together was definitely the most difficult part of this project. I'm not entirely sure why, but the needle would keep catching the material and dragging it down into the actual base of the machine, getting it tangled up inside. It was so difficult, in fact, that I actually had to get my roommate Nitro Cosplay in order to help me figure this out. Yes, I am name dropping him, so I can simply leave a link to his Instagram down below. He is an amazing cosplayer, so please give him a follow. So like this keeps happening. I've done this like 5 times.
Okay, calm down. The fuck?
Did it break again?
Yeah, but I didn't feel it do a breaking.
See what I mean? I got like halfway, I sewed halfway down.
You know that this isn't properly threaded, right?
Oh,
up here, down there, and through there.
Oh yeah, I had it properly threaded.
Yeah, but in all that, it may have undone, which has been, like, when I put in the proper, what it should be at, it it's not doing it because it's no longer properly threaded kind of thing. It's lining material. All the way through.
You lock both ends?
No.
No?
But it went all the way through.
Yeah. Thanks.
Slow and steady wins the race.
I don't know why I went backhand to high five, but okay. There we go.
Slow and steady wins the race.
Thank you, Nitro.
If you need to manually do the start it, and then once it's like maybe like a centimeter in, then you can just foot pedal it in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
That way you don't have to do the whole thing by hand.
Yeah. That would be so annoying if I did have to do that. Thank you. From there, I was able to sew the rest of the lining panels together. I then basted the lining to the outer panels of the bag. This was to secure it in place as I moved on to sewing the actual channel for the drawstring to go through. Now, unfortunately, the rest of the footage that I recorded is either unusable or lost, which means the rest of my voiceover is going to be done over the final product. Now, the drawstring channel ended up being a little tighter than I thought. As a result, it was actually a bit more difficult to actually thread the drawstring through, but I managed nonetheless. I also had decided to hand fell the top edge of the bag myself. To do this, I folded in the inner and outer panels of the bag down to the top edge of the drawstring channel, and then used a simple felling stitch to close it off. All in all, I am actually quite happy with the results. Now, by no means do not take this as a tutorial on how to do this project. As one of my more recent favorite YouTubers, Bernadette Banner, would say, this is more of an experiment for me, and very much just a personal project to see if I could do it. If you guys enjoyed this video, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more. I am going to try and upload as often as I can, but I cannot guarantee a weekly upload schedule as I am currently working a full-time job. But nevertheless, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Toodaloo! Toodaloo! Okay, that's what I'm going with, I guess. Bye!